Well, thank you all so much for joining us today, and for taking the time out of your busy schedules to celebrate this World Creativity and Innovation Week and Day as part of the United Nations International Day of Celebration. We're tremendously honored and pleased and happy to have you with us to talk about the topic of community-based creativity organizations, reimagining the world with purpose and impact. And as for individuals that are very deeply involved in various aspects of creativity and working with the communities and with the process of imagination and reimagining our world. I think this is going to be a really interesting panel. So thank you all for being with us.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you might just briefly introduce yourselves, just in whichever order seems most natural.
Well,
Um,
okay. My name's Michael Wilson, and I've been involved in collective creativity with various size groups for 1,000 years, and perhaps later on we can talk about some of that and put everybody asleep. But I think I'll leave it at there.
hmm. I'm Mary Blatherwick. I teach at the University of New Brunswick. I teach creativity and visual art education and have been deeply involved in community art education initiatives over the last 10 or 15 years.
Well, if Mary is our East Coast, Atlantic Canada, and Michael is our middle of the country, I'm our West, Wet Coast person. My name is Dr. Jillian Judson, and I'm an assistant professor at Simon Fraser University. And I have been involved with imagination research and collective imagination research groups for maybe only 100 years.
And I will jump in right now to introduce myself as Alexis Milligan, who has the opportunity to be on the steering committee with all of these lovely people of the Canadian Network for Imagination and Creativity, which is a national network that represents people from all across Canada working in all kinds of different fields that relate to creativity and imagination. Some of those places are Simon Fraser University, University of Ottawa, University of New Brunswick, and the Atlantic Centre for Creativity. And our goal is to unleash and promote imagination and creativity across all fields of endeavors, including arts, science, businesses, and education. And I am so very thrilled that we have the opportunity to connect with all of you today. This is very exciting.
Thank you all so much for your kind introductions. And, given that all of you are, community activists and you have been engaging people and students and practitioners in many ways and in various contexts, we really are going to structure today's conversation as more of just a spontaneous panel, being that all of you facilitators, it should be interesting. And I guess my first question is really around thinking about how you found yourselves at this intersection of working with creativity and imagination and this kind of community work. What sort of led you, both kind of individually and collectively, to this level of work?
Wow. You just, Michael.
I'll start just because let's get rid of the trivial first. Creativity, I think, can be seen as a process in many different polarities, but one that may be a helpful guide for this evening's conversation is the degree to which creativity is an individual activity and the degree to which it's the result of a collective activity. And most of my life has been concerned with creativity as a collective activity. So I'm very much a fan of Keith Sawyer and other people who write about the benefits of people getting together for creative purposes, or people getting together and discovering the magic of doing something together that none of the individuals could have done themselves, even if it was just the mere sum of their parts, the old anomaly of the sum is greater than the parts of a whole. And I think I was mostly conscious of that at the beginning. During my time as a failed jazz musician, I found that one of the things I had to learn as a musician, I was a trumpet flugelhorn player, so that's a single note at a time instrument. And you don't often play concerts of solo trumpet without other musicians. And so particularly when you have other improvising musicians as a jazz group. You have to learn how to listen very carefully to each other. It's as much a listening exercise as it is a playing one, and you need to be very sensitive to what each person is playing without necessarily verbally giving them cues. So that kind of sense of communicating beyond words um, was, for me at the time, a new phenomenon, and I think I carried that through virtually everything that I did. I went into a collectively minded profession, teaching schools, and then later on in universities. Uh, but I wasn't a joiner of a group. I was always a creator of a group. I always wanted to create people, to bring them together, to gather people together, and almost a ceremoniously interesting kind of way. You sort of a single purpose, but with everybody working together on that. And I did so for many years, from small groups of people, drama teachers in 1965 when we had zero resources for anything. None of us knew what to do. And so we got together. And I guess I got them together, first of all in Ottawa, and then later on in the province of Ontario. I guess it had something to do with the establishment of the Dance and Drama Teachers Association called Code in Ontario, which still exists. And I've always brought people together, or wanted to, and then realized the results of a kind of collective journey. It's a bit like being in a play, and you only have a small part, and you don't see the results of what you do until you see what happens in the magic of opening night. And I guess that's true of a large scale musical group like an orchestra and so on. I guess that's the same. But I wanted to do that with everybody. And even in my family life, I've always wanted to organize people. I've always wanted to get people together and do things together. And I don't know why that is. Except I think I was became aware of that through my attempt to become a jazz musician in the middle of the 17th century. So I think that's my story in terms of a pattern, that I've always been a person who likes to bring people together in a common quest. And if I can reduce my life's value to a single statement, I guess that's it.
Mm.
There, that's me.
Wow.
Great.
So beautiful and so wonderful. And thank you so much for that sharing, Michael, because so many thoughts come to mind when we hear you say that. I mean, on one hand, you speak so eloquently about so many themes that we, I think, cherish as Canadians, the sense of connection, the sense of community. And then you also talk about this notion of, you know, kind of collective creativity, collective imagination, acts of listening, and sort of working with others. And I know that these are some of the themes that your friends and colleagues who are scholars and researchers and performers and artists also are deeply involved with. Any other reflections on that, also based on kind of your own involvement from Mary and Julian and Alexis?
Mm. Well, just to kind of follow on Michael's ideas there and what he shared, and you were talking about like how we sort of got into thinking about these ideas. I think I go back to a really early experience for me where I was working in a speech and hearing clinic as the art director, and watching how just the amazing joy and excitement that these children had in expressing themselves creatively. And I went on to be an art educator. From that point, I decided to look for a place where I could study art education, a way that art became the vehicle for discussion and for connecting and so on. And so I just, again, like Michael, I love bringing people together. I love seeing the joy and excitement that they experience when they use their imaginations, when they share ideas, when they take risks, when they explore the possibilities of things. And so it was really kind of a mission to work in the schools and bring that to the forefront of a form of education that needed to be part of the educational system. And obviously we all face all these different challenges along the way. And so hence the development of not only the classroom setting that I've worked in and university setting, but also taking it to a wider community, because I think that creativity certainly in many ways is a very positive attribute that we have, a capacity, and the idea of building capacity, the idea of being able to get someone excited about what they can do, about their passions, and lead them through trusting their imagination, exploring their imagination, and discovering what can happen in terms of their own creative energy has been absolutely the basis of my whole career. And I can just say it's just so positive, and it's something that the world needs more than ever at the moment. So I feel that, or maybe we're coming into a time where suddenly, more people are beginning to see that capacity. And we have our schools to blame for some of the focus on conformity as opposed to creativity. And so I think as educators, all of us work against that, in the sense of, we know this is a capacity that needs time and energy, and brings so much joy and so much fulfillment and confidence to young people and to all ages. So it really is a life mission. and so that's sort of how I got started, but it's also how it continues for me to be a very rich and fulfilling career.
That's fantastic. I just feel so honored working with you both, Michael and Mary. At this point, you're both amazing artists, and Alexis too isn't sharing her experiences today, but she's also a performative artist, I believe. I wouldn't identify as an artist in that way, and I came to study imagination in my doctoral work when I had the great honor of working closely with Dr. Kieran Egan, who'd done a lot of research on the role of imagination in our development and how it can be explicitly engaged in teaching. Because I came as a public school teacher really wanting to do a better job of engaging my students. So in working with Kieran, I got to really dig into something I had taken for granted. And I think many teachers do. We want kids to be imaginative mostly. We talk more about it in elementary school, and then we tend to ignore it through high school and university as if it's a childish practice. So my work is really digging into what comes before creativity, which is imagination. And in working with Kieran Egan, he had already established the Imaginative Education Research Group when I began working with him. And one role I had when I was one of the directors of the Imaginative Education Research Group was sort of an outreach to teachers and educators. And one of the things I found after teaching a lot of master's programs with all of these educators doing fantastically imaginative things is there was really no place to share it. So in 2016, I started a blog called Imagine Ed, Education That Inspires. And it was sort of an effort to showcase and amplify imagination, teachers specifically using the word imagination, and the ways in which people that aren't only artists are employing imagination as well as artists. And then I was centrally involved in rebranding and relaunching the IERG into what became CIRSE, the Center for Imagination in Research, Culture, and Education, which is at Simon Fraser University, and still very closely connected to the legacy of Kieran Egan. But I feel like the only way we will address the misunderstanding that continues to leave imagination marginalized and ignored is if we infiltrate communities. And if we create our own community, and then you think of that community heading out into other communities, sort of saying, well, no, imagination isn't just for kids, and it's not completely detached from reality, and it does matter for leaders, and it does matter in these other contexts. So for me, it's almost collaboration obviously enables more imagination, but collaboration will also help in this mission, as Mary referred to it. I agree, it's a mission for me to just address misconceptions, help people see how they are imaginative and creative in different ways.
Yeah, great.
So maybe this is why I get to be part of the panel from the other end to ask these questions of my colleagues that I know, but really to deep dive into further understanding of the work you do. Okay, so Gillian, if you want to infiltrate and really start to expand ideas, what would be one thing, or maybe there's a couple of things that you think someone could actually try, have a go at, or encounter, or what would be one of those methods? I'd love to hear from each of you. But I'll just go back to Gillian quickly, because it's like, if you could do something or encourage something to start that ball rolling, to help a community or people within a group to come together to try something, what would be something that's on your dream list of possibilities?
I think I like to think of myself as an imagination accomplice. I don't want to call us allies. I don't need more allies. I don't need more people saying, go Jillian, go, go. I need people down there with me, accomplices, talking about imagination. So my response would be something that makes us feel, some kind of an activity that makes us feel, because we are feeling per thinking beings. We perceive and we feel and we think at the same time. So how can we help people acknowledge that imagination is something they enjoy, imagination is something they employ, imagination is something also that we, by using it, can cultivate it. I think one small little exercise that could be employed in any context is an exercise where we make the familiar strange. Mm-hmm. So Kieran Egan would refer to that as evoking a sense of wonder. And one of his favorite things he used to do was he would hold up just a disposable coffee cup and he'd say, what is this? And everyone, it's a coffee cup. And he'd say, actually, I beg to differ. It's a feat of human creativity and imagination and engineering and ingenuity that I can hold scalding liquid just a fraction of an inch from my fingers and I'm not burning myself. This is far more than a cup. This is a creation that is striving for greatness and has glimmers of wonder within it. So he suddenly made something familiar strange, because I think one of the ways we exist in the world evolutionarily is to decrease the wonder of things. If we were startled at every moment by how everything around us was fantastic and extraordinary, we wouldn't manage to survive, right? So we kind of diminish the fascinating. But if we as groups can begin to look at things in new ways and consider what is wonderful, what makes this full of wonder, what we begin to do is acknowledge that the world is wonderful. We can maybe crack open a little bit of the commonplace conceptions we have of things. And ultimately, in a maybe more serious tone, we can use additional tools of imagination, not just sense of wonder, to break open those really fixed ways in which we think about things in our professions and in our lives. We need a tool to crack open those fixed ways of thinking. And I think that using a sense of wonder to find what it is about everything that makes it like that coffee cup, striving for greatness. Then once we practice doing that, it becomes easier and easier. So that's my long-winded response.
That's fantastic. Okay, Mary, what do you think? What's something that someone could have a go at?
Well, I mean, I instantly think of, again, when Jillian's talking about a coffee cup or a styrofoam cup. I often start with an exercise with divergent thinking, and I'll hold up a cup that is very familiar, as you say, and say, I'd like you to list at least 20 or 30 different uses for this cup that are completely outrageous, that are just like wild ideas. And so they'll come up with everything from party hats to a nose to a new type of telephone to, a mouse trap. I mean, everything you can possibly imagine. So I'm pushing that imagination piece, like what can you do with something that's ordinary, and really get them to think outside the box. And it's really quite funny, because obviously what they share with each other is usually very comical. So that's a very, very, very simple activity. And I do a lot of things like just around observation. And again, I think using the senses to get into include across the board. It's all of us have creative capacity. So playing with the idea of the senses, and maybe it's a sight, a recall activity where they remember something and then they recall it, not having to draw it, just having to recall it. So I'm actually beginning to get them to observe more closely the world around them. Sound. You can do a sound recording and have them guess at what the sound is, and imagine what the sound could be, which is also really interesting. So really simple activities that would be non-threatening. There's no right or wrong answer to any of that, but it starts to push them into a different zone where they're beginning to pay attention more closely to their senses. And also that divergent activity is saying, like, what if, what if? Let's be playful here. It doesn't have to be a logical way, a logical solution to something. And that element of play is a really great way of getting people to relax and begin to use their imaginations and to be more creative.
Wow, that's great. Okay, Michael.
I just want to continue the basic image that Jillian started about making the familiar strange, or I like to take it on a collective level with students I used to teach at the university, and I'd start off with them collectively in a group of, we had classes of 40 students, something like that, and I'd start off by so far, and they'd all have to agree, but was always something about some professor um, providing lectures that seemed to have some content that had nothing to do with, often stuff I used to do. Anyway, and I'd say, right, and we'd have a competition about what ultimately was the most boring thing about the program. And once they had settled something to do with that, I'd say, well, let's turn it upside down. What would happen if that very thing that's boring, in fact, was the reverse? It was the most special ceremony of your entire life. What would it be like if this was the moment of destiny for you all, and afterwards your life would be completely transformed? And so they would then have to redesign that incredibly dull, boring, insignificant, repetitive, um, completely meaningless task into something that was the reverse of that. And it would be amazing sometimes after they go through an exercise collectively and they go through a ceremony, which always means, for example, a crowd going to a specified place in a particular kind of way and forming up in that space in a kind of predetermined manner. And always, every ceremony has one thing that's very similar, and that as at the pivotal moment of the ceremony, there's always something, either an object or a ceremonial object, exchanged from at least one person to at least one other. The examples of weddings and birthday party. And so they had to invent that with something that was incredibly boring, a piece of chalk or a blackboard eraser or another slide on the computer, something. And once they go through the ridiculousness of all of that, and I hope that it makes them all laugh at themselves and each other at the same time, sometimes they get some insight into how that boring thing that they started with, in fact, had some special qualities that had some meaning after all. Somehow you go back to the beginning and see it freshly by going through an upside down kind of exercise, which was the image that Jillian started with. And Mary, you extended. So I like to do that collectively with an entire class. And there's a playfulness in there, particularly creating moments where they laugh at themselves and each other, and it has to be at the same time. And then when you do that, you build a collective trust for people to make mistakes and not feel embarrassed about making mistakes, or collectively for them to take chances and fall flat on their faces, because, as the creativity literature indicates, for every creative moment that happens, you have 90% of the moments which go nowhere. Mistakes are made. Creatives always talk about that for all the single great novels people write, they write a lot of trash. Excuse me, I got a gold. So anyway, I think that's an extension of what Jillian started with, and seems to me that we can get a lot of mileage talking about those kinds of things. And by the way, I want you to know this is only tea.
It's just wonderful. And I so appreciate Alexis's provocation and wonderful question. And I mean, in the remaining few minutes, I wonder if you might reflect on in your work individually and together. I mean, what do you feel the role of community-based, creativity organizations might be or has played in reimagining the world with purpose and impact? What are some of your observations around that?
Well, I'm going to leave it a mystery first as to what is in my cup, because I don't see any problem with it not being tea. I would say that I think the impact is really profound, because we're talking about something that requires courage. It really does. And so the only way we can hope that people will cultivate and enact and speak up for something that, has them running one way when the group tends to run the other, is if they have the support of community and people that will applaud them in making that move. So I think it's required for actual advancement and enactment of the work.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly that to be able to do that, to the support you need around that to the creative act. Yeah, I think it's so true. And I think for me, the connections that you make, the creativity in the most simplest form is making connections. And that's part of the joyful part of it, but also what we do to build community. And community is connection. It is forming connections. And I think that creativity and imagination are things that are they enrich the human experience. They bring us together. They allow us to solve problems together, to find solutions, take risks together. It's really so important. It's like the glue, it's the thing that brings us together. And I think, we're at a time where recognizing creativity, like I'm lately talking about recognition of creativity a lot, like realizing what that thing is that holds us together and allows us to make decisions and to try new things and so on. Is all around us, but we don't necessarily put a label on it. But anyway, for building community, it's absolutely key.
I think it's essential for world peace. If I could add a macro concept to what they both said. Yeah, when you bring any group together and they accomplish something together, especially if it's something that they made or created out of nothing, when they didn't start with anything. And I think of people involved in a theater project or any kind of collective creative project when you're starting with nothing except perhaps words on a page. And then to actually go through the process of mounting that into a theater production. And I like the image of theater because often along the way, you only know what you're doing. Or if you're an actor, what the other actors are doing, you have no idea what the lighting designer is doing. Or if it's a musical, what the score is going to be. You only find out really, I guess, sort of at the final dress rehearsal. But even then, it's opening night, right? And it's a very similar thing with a musical group. But it's anybody can do that. A group of 5 or 6 people get together to do something that needs to be done. And if they work on it together and they accomplish it at the end, there's that feeling of accomplishment of doing something collectively with other people. And with those particular people, you have a sense of communion, of peace, and a lack of hostility. So, on a macro level, if we can get entire nations to be like that, I suppose you could argue the current world situation is such that at least the nations of Western Europe and North America are closer together now because of a common adversary than they've been since the Second World War. So there's a certain benefit to adversarial situations because it tends to bring people together. That's a bit of a leap from the kinds of things that Jillian and Mary are talking about. But I think the idea is the same, that it's a very human process to be involved in creativity. And, as we speak, if we're not reading a script, we're being creative. I'm creatively making up this language as I speak. And as you can tell, not very well. But I'm doing it. I'm not reading anything, in fact, I'm distracted by the names of all the people that appear at the bottom of everybody's picture. And I'm thinking, oh, I didn't know there was spelling. Anyway, so I think Mary's point, particularly about that creativity is all around us and we tend not to see it because we associate the word as something that only artists or academics do. But in fact, it's all around us and all we have to do is discover it.
Mm-hmm.
That's really incredible. Okay, we're just going to literally take a last few minutes here to just, in terms of community base, in terms of this macro level, and I think Michael, that's exactly what it is there. It exists on all levels. It exists between children on the playground and within the United Nations. It exists in how we relate to each other. Creativity is like you say, it's how we figure out how we're going to work together, come together in groups, come together in communities. Is there any part of the work that each of you are doing now that you would hope could be carried forward, or ideas that you would like to see grow in terms of application and terms of being able to develop further just again, as we sort of wrap up our conversation, where do you see the future of this work?
I just want to jump in on one point, Alexis, very quickly, and it relates to what you said. You talked about the United Nations. Well, isn't it interesting that this event we're doing right now is connected to UNESCO? Okay, now
I was
somebody
just a
else.
little tie in there, Michael.
Yeah, I just thought I'd mention that. Sorry, go ahead.
Maybe I'll jump in just given my restraints. For me, I've just started to do some research around the impact of positionality on the ability to employ imagination, how issues of race and gender and sexuality and ability impact our ability to actually do and use imagination. So I think if we're moving towards a more inclusive sense of the world, and acknowledging the systemic racism in the systems in which we work, we can't assume that we can all, in fact, employ imagination in the same way, or that we all feel as comfortable employing it. So I think there's that dimension that I would like to pursue and continue. And whether it's imagination or creativity, the two things together, what is the class, race, gendered features of that limit how and when we employ imagination?
Mm. It's sort of a big question. How do we take all this forward? Certainly, there's areas like I look at the notion of educational programming, what's happening in the schools, what's happening in the university, and the very slow movement that takes place. It's such a hard sell to get more art, to get more creative courses, to get imagination accepted in the schools. And I think there's more and more interest in it, but it seems so slow moving. So I still feel a need to work at all those levels, at the elementary, junior high, or middle school, high school, and university levels. And I found the universities somewhat slow as well. In fact, there's a real need for buy-in at the university level. We're still very stuck on, obviously, accreditation. It's always about who has the right answer, and that's what you do on an exam. You don't vary. You gotta stick with the plan. And I think we need to provide more diverse programming, opportunities for people to study different areas of a program, come up with new ideas, take risks, and be rewarded for that, not to be and disciplined for that, because I think we're still in this kind of world where there's only one right answer. And I think that's something that's still, to me, is that I'll work on it for as long as I live, I'm sure, because I think we need to allow people to have a voice and be heard, and for their imaginations to grow, to know that it's okay to have a new idea or to come up with a new solution and to have that valued. So I think we have a big piece to do there. And the other piece, I think, is in community. I think the pandemic has done some really weird things to us in terms of separating us and creating isolation for a lot of people and so on. So when a community comes together, and I talked about this recently in a talk that I gave, but even a small community that's struggling might decide to get together and have concerts, or get together and play music, or get together and maybe build some kind of structure or a playground for children, or whatever it may be. But the idea of getting together and sharing our creative energies. So I think that's one way to illustrate the value of it. And the other thing is to still work on the kind of programming, that sort of really structural thing that we do, that we still have, that we really is the underpinning of our society. So I think that has to shift as well.
Building again on, I'm trying to contradict Jillian and Mary, or to get an argument going here. I'm having a lot of trouble. I have to acknowledge the wisdom of what both of them are saying. And maybe I'll put it this way. Society wants to keep things the way they are because we collectively are all involved in organizations which thrive on keeping established structures robust and in place. And so the notion and idea of creativity is actually anti-establishment view. We are threatening the status quo. Everything Jillian said about our place in society from the point of view of race, gender, cultural, so on, is absolutely the case. And we have tremendous forces to keep things as it were. you know, and Mary talked about the educational system, and it's so true, but it's true of everything. And the problem with that is if the forces, you know, want us to remain the same because we all hate change, you know, from basic routines that we've established. In order for human civilization to survive, I think the basic struggle, the basic challenge we have, and we have to do it, is to come up with new solutions to new problems, whether it's climate change or any of the things that we've talked about, and all, but also to the local problems we face, where we have a challenge that we can only solve it by changing something. So we need to be the agents of that sense of change. We need to constantly resist the comfort zone of keeping things the way they are because we have to change. Because if we don't change, we will cease to exist. You know, the Incas disappeared for a reason. And lost civilizations disappeared mostly, not so much because they were conquered by someone else, but because they refused to change in the directions they needed to for the challenges that they faced. And the world has enormous challenges, and we need to find new solutions, creative ways of dealing with those in order to survive. So we are the leaders, us four and others like us. We are the beacons of light in order for the world to stay afloat.
Mm-hmm.
There's a
Wow,
mixed metaphor.
what a way to close the conversation. Thank you, Alexis, for such a wonderfully framed question, and many thanks to our panel for such brilliant and insightful responses. I wish we had more time. Hopefully, we will actually create a half-day symposium and have the three of you actually explicate these ideas in much more detail. And I think for the amount of time we had today, you've really touched upon some essential and core issues that I think are very much inspirational to us all. On behalf of the World Creativity and Innovation Weekend Day, I would like to thank you for participating and donating your valuable time and sharing these wonderful ideas with us. Thank you so much.
Thank
Our
you.
pleasure.
And thank you, everyone, on behalf of the Canadian Network for Imagination and Creativity. I'm sorry, we know that Jillian had to sign off quickly because she was heading off into a class. But thank you for joining us and having this in-depth, again, learning new things about colleagues I've known for some years. It's very exciting.
Okay, we are the mics turned off now?